Despite the tendency of social control to enforce conformity as a potent mechanism in the socialization process, there are forms of behavior that are relatively or distinctly set away from the norm, which can be referred to as deviance or nonconformity. These behavioral patterns can be tolerated, approved, or disapproved, depending on societal views. It is divided into two types, formal and informal.
A person holding up a convenience store and a pacifist at a protest might seem like polar opposites, but they actually have something in common. So do an American vegan preparing a meal at home, and a white-collar criminal committing tax fraud, and a runaway slave. They're all social deviants. We've spent a lot of time so far talking about how society fits together and how it functions, but we can't cover that in any meaningful way without also talking about the people who don't fit. We have to talk about who's normal and who's deviant, and how they get to be that way. Now, you might think that calling pacifists and vegans and runaway slaves deviant is rude, but in sociology, deviance isn't an insult. Deviance simply means being non-normative. Different. So while this does include some things that we might think of as bad or harmful, like crime, it also includes things that we might just think of as outside the mainstream. So if eating a burger is a traditional all-American cultural activity, then being a vegan in America is deviant. But there's something important to notice here. I didn't say being a vegan in a society where most people eat meat is deviant, because deviance is not just a matter of numbers. Deviance is anything that deviates from what people generally accept as normal. For instance, red hair is statistically uncommon, but it's not considered deviant. Dyeing your hair bright purple, that is deviant and might earn you some strange looks from some people. And strange looks from strangers are a form of social control. Attempts by society to regulate people's thoughts and behaviors in ways that limit or punish deviance. Specifically, the strange looks are what are known as negative sanctions, negative social reactions to deviance. The opposite, naturally, are positive sanctions, affirmative reactions, usually in response to conformity. Once you start looking, you begin to see forms of social control, both positive and negative, everywhere. A friend making fun of your taste in food, or a teacher congratulating you on a good paper, or someone commenting loudly on your bright purple hair. Sanctions all. These are all examples of informal norms, or what sociologists call folkways. You won't be arrested for violating a folkway, but breaking them usually results in negative sanctions. But not all norm violations are informally sanctioned. Formal sanctioning of deviance occurs when norms are codified into law, and violation almost always results in negative sanctions from the criminal justice system, the police, the courts, and the prison system. So given the power of formal sanctions, why does anyone do deviant things? This is a big question. Before we get to the sociological perspective, we need to mention some of the biological and psychological views of deviance that have been influential in the past. Spoiler alert, historically these explanations have been insufficient in helping us understand non-normative behavior. For example, the earliest attempts at scientific explanations for deviance, and crime in particular, are biologically essentialist explanations. They were based on the idea that something about a person's essential biology made them deviant. In 1876, Cesare Lombroso, an Italian physician, theorized that criminals were basically subhuman, throwbacks to a more primitive version of humanity. He went so far as to suggest that deviance could be singled out based on physical characteristics like a low forehead, stocky build, and prominent jaw and cheekbones, all of which he saw as reminiscent of our primate cousins. Another scientist, US psychologist William Sheldon, also found a relationship between general body type and criminality. In the 1940s and 50s, he studied body types and behavior and concluded that men who were more muscular and athletic were more likely to be criminally deviant. We know today that the idea that physical features somehow correspond to criminality is just no, it's wrong. But later work by Eleanor and Sheldon Glueck appeared to confirm William Sheldon's basic findings on male muscularity and criminal aggression. However, they refused to ascribe their results to a biological explanation. They countered that a simple correlation between body type and criminality could not be taken as causal evidence. Instead, they argued that this was an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. People expect physically strong boys to be bullies, and so they encourage aggressive behavior in such boys. Large boys who have their bullying behavior positively sanctioned are encouraged to continue being aggressive, and some eventually grow up and engage in and aggressive criminal behaviors. Psychological approaches, by contrast, place almost all the explanatory power in a person's environment. While some elements of personality may be inherited, psychologists generally see personality as a matter of socialization. So they see deviance as a matter of improper or failed socialization. A classic example of this strain of psychological explanation is found in the 1967 work of Walter Reckless and Simon Dinitz. They studied boys who lived in an urban neighborhood known for its high rate of delinquency. Using the assessment of the boys' teachers, they grouped the youths into good boys and bad boys, and then interviewed them to construct psychological profiles. They found that the so-called good boys had a strong conscience, were good at coping with frustration, and identified with conventional cultural norms. The bad boys, on the other hand, were opposite on all counts. Following the boys over time, Reckless and Dinitz found that the good boys had fewer run-ins with the police, and they attributed this to the boys' ability to control deviant impulses. This idea that deviance is essentially a matter of impulse control is called containment theory, or having a personality that contains deviant actions. And containment theory has received support in recent research, including a 2011 study on 500 male fraternal twins that assessed their self-control, resilience, and ability to delay gratification. Researchers found that the brother who scored lower on these measures in childhood was more likely to be criminally deviant in adulthood. Now, while we've seen that there's clearly value in both biological and psychological approaches, they're each also fundamentally limited. For example, both kinds of explanations link criminal deviance to individual factors, either of body or of mind, while leaving out other important factors like peer influence or what opportunities for deviance different people might be exposed to. Plus, biological and psychological explanations only understand deviance as a matter of abnormality. Both approaches begin by looking for physical or mental irregularities, whereas more recent research suggests that most people who do deviant things are both biologically and psychologically normal, or to use a better word, let's say typical. Finally, neither biology nor psychology can answer the question of why the things that are deviant are considered deviant in the first place. Even if you could 100% prove that a certain abnormality caused people to be violent, not all violence is considered a form of deviance. Think boxing. And here's where we can turn to a sociological approach, which sees deviance and criminality as the result of how society is structured. And here the approach is based on three major ideas. First is the idea that deviance varies according to cultural norms. In other words, nothing is inherently deviant. Cultural norms vary from culture to culture and over time and place. So what's deviant now might have once been quite normal. Slavery is an obvious example. Not only was race-based slavery normal in 19th century America, rejecting it was considered deviant. So deviant, in fact, that physician Samuel Cartwright wrote about a disorder he called drapetomania to explain the supposed mental disorder that caused slaves to flee captivity. The second major principle sociologists draw on is the idea that people are deviant because they're labeled as deviant. What I mean here is that it's society's response that defines us or our actions as deviant. The same action can be deviant or not, depending on the context. Sleeping in a tent in a public place can be illegal, or it can be a fun weekend activity, depending on where you do it. And as the Gluex argued, labeling people can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. When society treats you as deviant, it's very easy to become one. Deviance doesn't even necessarily require action. Simply being a member of a group can classify you as a deviant in the eyes of society. The rich may view the poor with disdain or imagined moral failures, or we can return again to racism and slavery, which imagined African Americans as deviant by nature. And the last major sociological principle for understanding deviance is the idea that defining social norms involves social power. The law is many things, but Karl Marx argued that one of its roles is as a means for the powerful elite to protect their own interests. This is obvious in the case of something like fugitive slave laws, which applied a formal negative sanction to deviating from the norms of slavery. But we can also see it in things like the difference between a campaign rally and a spontaneous protest. Both are public political speech, and both may block traffic, but they draw resoundingly different reactions from police. So these are three foundational ideas about the sociological perspective on deviance, but I want to stress that they only begin to define a perspective. Sociology clearly understands deviance in a different way than biology and psychology do, but if you really want to dive into more detailed sociological explanations, you'll need to wait until next week when we look at the major theoretical explanations for crime and deviance. Today we learned about social deviance. We discussed biological and psychological approaches to explaining deviance, what they can bring to the table, and their inherent limitations. Then we finished by turning to the sociological perspective and talking about the social foundations of deviance. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people. Our animation team is Thought Cafe, and Crash Course is made with Adobe Creative Cloud. If you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content you love. Thank you to all of our patrons for making Crash Course possible with their continued support.
Formal deviance includes actions that violated the enacted laws such as robbery, theft, graft, rape, and other forms of criminality. Informal deviance, on the other hand, refers to violations to social norms that are not codified into laws, such as belching loudly, spitting on streets, pricking one's nose, among others. Deviance is also seen as a form of power struggle. Determining what is deviant and what is not, is closely tied with the existing power structures of a society. In the Philippines, the existence of political dynasties and monopolies, and the rampant electioneering activities during polls, is considered a manifestation of deviancy, and a blatant reflection of the power imbalance and inequality in society. Taboos related to food are also manifestations of deviancy. Though these practices are case-to-case basis, since what one society may view as deviant, may not be true to others, which is perceived as normative, traditional, or desirable. In the same way, cultural food and cultural food habits vary. Cultural and religious food prohibitions differ to some extent. Hindus are prohibited to eat beef since cow is considered sacred in India. Muslims and Jews abstain from eating pork, as pigs are considered unclean. These types of meat, however, are widely consumed by members of other cultures and religion. Drinking alcoholic beverages are not allowed in many religious faith and sectarian denominations. Blood and alcohol, for instance, are taboo for Muslims. Other food taboos are more cultural than religious. Among Western countries, the consumption of a dog or cat meat is viewed as deviant since these animals are commonly kept as pets. A practice that is directly opposite to some subgroups in Africa and Asia, who utilized these animals as food or food offerings during rituals. Similarly, small animals like rodents, rats and mice, and even insects perceived as pests, Western culture, these creatures are common fare in many parts of Asia and Africa. Insects are even popular staples in Southeast Asia such as crickets, in the Philippines, black spiders, in Cambodia, and black beetles and cockroaches, in Thailand. Now, let us talk about social, political, and cultural change. What is common about the three photos you have seen? Basically, their common denominator speaks about change, which is our topic. Change is generally pervasive and is taking place in culture, society, and politics. Changes in culture bring about changes in society and human beings. Likewise, changes in society and human beings bring about changes in culture and politics. These changes are even overlapping and interdependent in contemporary times due to factors affecting social mobility, like migration, urbanization, transnationalism, and globalization. But for the sake of discussion, let us define each type of change either in social, political, or cultural aspects. Social change refers to variations or modifications in the patterns of social organization, of subgroups within a society, or of the entire society itself. This may be manifested in the rise or fall of groups, community, or institutional structures and functions, or change in statuses and roles of members in the family, work setting, church, government, and other subsystems of social organization.
Ah, the past. A time without video games, smartphones, anti-lock brakes, and many basic human rights we enjoy today. Things that are ordinary now used to be considered wild and crazy notions. Take voting. Not that long ago, the very thought of women at the ballot box had people in a tizzy. But after decades of fighting, the suffragists prevailed. And since then, our collective attitude towards women's rights has continued to expand. Today, the thought of women not having the right to vote is ludicrous. So, how do we get from there to here? How does social change happen? First of all, when we talk about making social change, we're often talking about changing cultural values. These are the core principles and ideals upon which an entire community exists. They are part of everyday life and feel as natural as breathing. For example, in the United States, one of these core ideals is freedom of speech. But even something so fundamental, like what freedom of speech even means, has changed over time. Why? Well, for one thing, technology changes over time. Technology is a big factor in social change. Here's one example. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the popularization of the bicycle played an important role in the women's suffrage movement. Bikes were a new technology that gave women more than a means of transportation. The bicycle meant freedom. They wanted to use that new freedom. So the bicycle helped empower women to demand other freedoms, like being able to vote. The activist Susan B. Anthony even said, "Woman is riding to suffrage on the bicycle." It helped women to challenge social norms in everyday life. The women's movement had already been underway for decades, having launched nationally at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. But the 19th Amendment, which granted voting rights to women, wasn't ratified until 1920. So it took the suffragists, 7 decades to get the vote? And when they did, then everything immediately worked out great, right? No problems. Justice! Yeah, right. So, why is it so hard to change society? Social change often arises from conflict. Many people in dominant groups resist social change. The status quo represents their core beliefs or benefits them. They actively want things to stay the same. Or maybe it's just that they don't think that issue affects them. So why do anything? Either way, that pushback means social change is not smooth. Here's just one extreme example. In the 1870s, the Ku Klux Klan targeted Southern white people who had lost the Civil War and their entire economic system based on slavery. Then, the next wave of the KKK used new technology to revive their cause. Propaganda films that were designed to spread and normalize their racist values. Of course, these cultural shifts and the resulting pushback are nothing new. Dina Rollinger, professor of sociology at Florida State University, tells us more.
We want to think of social change as uncomplicated, but it's anything but. So one of the things that you really need is you need to have a social movement. You need to have a diverse set of groups that generally share a goal and are acting more or less together to enact some kind of change. But that alone is not enough. You have to have politicians or other kinds of elites who also think that the issue is important. You need public support. And oftentimes you need some kind of event, something that really gets people's attention and puts an issue on the radar.
Movements take decades of people gathering public support and lobbying to get new laws on the books. But laws are only one piece of the complex puzzle that shifts public opinion and makes new ideas feel normal. Those ideas become part of our socialization, the process that teaches the norms, values, and other aspects of culture. We're socialized by institutions like our families, schools, friends, and mass media. And of course, technology is another piece of the puzzle. The internet and social media now help ideas spread faster than ever before. Our beliefs are informed by all these social environments. For example, the belief in marriage equality. In 1996, when Gallup first asked about that issue, only 27% of Americans supported it. A 2018 Gallup poll showed that 67% of Americans supported same-sex marriage. That's a huge shift. Through decades of social movements and political actions, marriage equality gained traction, eventually tipping into mainstream acceptance. In 2015, the Supreme Court reflected that belief, ruling that the Constitution guarantees a right to same-sex marriage. But even then, it wasn't unanimous. It was a 5-4 vote. And that's how social change happens. It's not like everyone all of a sudden just decides to agree.
We have to take a really long view to social change and cultural change. Oftentimes, political change will precede it. You have to think about a relatively small group of people trying to convince the rest of culture, the rest of society, and politicians that their way of viewing the world is not abnormal, but completely legitimate. And that's not an easy task.
Back to that earlier example. Women's suffrage was followed by the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and the 1970s, which led to third wave feminism, which created an environment that now supports new ideas about what gender even means. Here's another way of looking at it. Social change often acts like waves in the ocean. One wave crashes against the shore, and then another rolls in. The waves build on each other, and then one day, everything looks different. Thousands of years ago, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, "The only thing that is constant is change." Social change is complicated, and it takes a long time. It arises from conflict and people coming together because of that conflict. So what do you want your world to look like?
There are 3 causes of social change. 1. Invention. 2. Discovery. 3. Diffusion. Invention is often defined as a new combination or a new use of existing knowledge. It produces mechanical objects, ideas, and social patterns that reshape our society to varying degrees. Can be classified into material inventions, like bow and arrow, mobile phone, and airplane, and social inventions, like alphabet, texting, and social networking.
These ideas changed the world. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 inventions of all time. Number 10. Paper. One of the Chinese people's 4 great inventions, paper was invented and developed in the 2nd century BC by the Han Dynasty. The idea eventually traveled to Europe, where paper mills began manufacturing the product on a larger scale. Without paper, the printing press would never have been invented, and our world would be very different. We would not have maps, paper currency, or books to disperse information. Its impact is truly endless. Number 9. The compass. Before the compass, sailors depended on landmarks or even the stars to navigate their ships. But once the Chinese began using lodestones and magnetism to find their bearings between the 9th and 11th centuries, it quickly spread to the Arab world and to Europe. This not only made circumnavigation of the globe easier, it also made it safer, which kicked off the age of discovery. Number 8. Refrigeration. Though ice was used since prehistoric times to prevent food from spoiling and developing bacteria, the concept of refrigeration was only developed in earnest starting in the mid-1700s. The process was then refined and improved, changing the way the food industry transports and stores food. The implications of this discovery are far-reaching, as it transformed the way we eat and live. Number 7. The printing press. Though Johannes Gutenberg is credited with this invention, he actually perfected and popularized existing technology. By combining the Chinese principle of movable type with European press systems already in use for winemaking, Gutenberg created the machine that printed text on a wide scale, which in turn lowered the price of books and helped spread information and knowledge to the masses, spurring the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the scientific revolution. Number 6. Plumbing. The landscape of major cities would be drastically different without this innovation. After all, how would a high-rise exist without modern plumbing? Evolving from holes in the ground to chamber pots to outhouses and eventually to flush toilets as early as the 31st to 26th centuries BC, the development of plumbing improved living conditions for millions of people across the globe and lengthened our lifespans. Number 5. Medicine. Many medicines and vaccinations have extended and changed our lives significantly. Discovered by accident by Alexander Fleming, penicillin was the first group of drugs that fought illnesses like syphilis and strep infections. On the other side of the spectrum, since they were introduced to the public in the 1960s, contraceptives such as the birth control pill helped level out the global population and launched a revolution in social change. Number 4. Engines. These engines got industry and the population moving. Instead of relying on horses as transportation, people traveled across the countryside via Thomas Newcomen's steam engine as of 1712, which was improved upon by James Watt later that century, quickly becoming the backbone of society and sparking the Industrial Revolution. Internal combustion ultimately replaced steam and ushered in the Second Industrial Revolution, and allowed individuals to affordably travel great distances. Number 3. The wheel. Though it's still unclear which civilization was first to invent this simple machine in the 4th century BC, it's obvious that it's been one of the world's most vital innovations. The transportation, commerce, and travel industries wouldn't be the same without it, and today the wheel can be found in every aspect of our daily lives, from water wheels, gears, motors, and engines to more fun applications. Number 2. Communications. Several inventions changed global communications forever. Samuel Morse brought us the electric telegraph in 1836. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone was the first to be awarded a patent to transmit voices in 1876. Guglielmo Marconi and Nikola Tesla developed radio in the late 19th century. Moving pictures first came across John Logie Baird's television in 1925. Conrad Zuse developed the first computer in the early 40s, and Tim Berners-Lee proposed the World Wide Web in the late 80s, and they all made the world a little bit smaller. Before we unveil our number 1 pick, here are a few honorable mentions. Number 1. Electricity. Not only did sleep patterns change drastically with the introduction of electricity, so did work habits. From Ben Franklin to Nikola Tesla to Michael Faraday to Thomas Edison, many innovators made important contributions to this modernization, which brought light and power to the masses. However, electricity only became a necessity and standard to everyday life in the mid-20th century. Before that, it was enjoyed mainly in the big cities. Do you agree with our list? Which inventions could you not live without? For more informative top 10s published every day, be sure to subscribe to WatchMojo.com.
Discovery, on the other hand, takes place when people recognized existing elements of the world they had not noticed before, or learned to see in a new way. Oftentimes, this contributes to the emergence of a new paradigm or perspective, and even reshape and reinvent worldviews. In addition to the store of verified knowledge, it provides something new to the culture, because it became an integral part of the culture only after discovery happened, or took place.
Isaac Asimov said it best. The most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not Eureka, but that's funny. Throughout the history of science, many major discoveries came accidentally. Sometimes they came from recognizing potential in an unexpected product or even in a failed recipe's waste, turning accident into serendipity. Other times, discovery came out of pure desperation from a seemingly dead-end experiment. See, the entire modern chemical industry can be attributed to an accidental discovery that started with, well, garbage. In the 19th century, there was a new kind of waste floating around, coal tar. This was a stinky, sticky, awful muck left over from turning coal into gaslight. Before others figured out you could pave roads with this stuff, it was pretty much useless. Then the head of London's Royal College of Chemistry had an idea. August Wilhelm von Hofmann noticed that some of the stuff in coal tar was similar to the stuff in known medicines. If he got the chemistry right, he thought, the world would have cheap, easy cures for disease. So, in 1856, he assigned 18-year-old William Perkin to Team Coal Tar. Perkin's job was to try to turn the gunk into quinine. Quinine was used to treat malaria, but the drug had to be extracted from tree bark, and that was time-consuming and really annoying. Perkin knew that quinine and coal tar had similar chemical formulas, so he figured, take some of the stuff that's in coal tar that's similar to quinine, add some other stuff that looks like little bits of quinine, then remove the useless byproducts, and voila, right? Yeah, not so much. Perkin's first attempts got a reddish-black powder instead of off-white quinine crystals, so he made a couple changes and tried it again. Instead of off-white powder, he got an even blacker powder. Oh well, wash it out with a little alcohol and start over, right? But wait, when he added the alcohol, the black powder produced a breathtaking purple. Perkin was inspired. He somehow figured out this purple stuff could dye silk. Perkin saw dollar signs. At the time, purple-dyed fabrics were made using exotic crushed snails, so only the very wealthy could afford to wear purple. Forget crushed snails, Perkin just made purple dye out of garbage! Perkin called this stuff mauve, after a French flower, because, well, trashy purple didn't quite sound appealing. Dreaming of broad profit margins, Perkin did what many entrepreneurs did. He quit and started perhaps the first artificial dye factory. Within a few years, mauve had two influential fashion fans, Queen Victoria and Napoleon III's wife, Empress Eugenie. A fashion craze known as mauve measles erupted. Suddenly, the middle class could afford a color beyond drab brown, off-white, or gray. Perkin amassed a fortune of more than $100 million in today's dollars and retired at the ripe old age of 36. On Perkin's lead, chemical factories sprang up, dumpster diving nature for treasure, and this led to even more profitable accidents. In 1878, Konstantin Fallberg brought his gunky coal tar work home with him by not washing his hands. At dinner one night, he found his bread incredibly sweet. Fallberg and his lab mates realized the source was a super sweet substance derived from coal tar residue they called saccharin. The accidental discoveries only grew in the 20th century. In the late 1930s, Roy Plunkett at DuPont was working with refrigerants named fluorinated hydrocarbons. One day, a new mix annoyingly solidified into a powder that made stuff slippery. Plunkett had stumbled on a new material called polytetrafluoroethylene, which DuPont marketed as Teflon. Teflon was awesome! It coated metal for a no-stick surface, and also Teflon didn't conduct electricity, so it was great for wire coating. This led father and son team Bill and Bob Gore to work with Teflon to make computer cables. Bill and Bob discovered that Teflon didn't stretch evenly, making it hard to work with. Frustrated, Bob yanked on a hunk of heated Teflon. It suddenly expanded to 8 times its size. Turns out this heated, stretched hunk was over 70% air, so it could breathe easily while retaining the no-stick properties of its Teflon parent. And if you wove this into a fabric, it proved fantastic for lightweight raincoats that don't wrap you in your own sauna. You know this material as Gore-Tex. So much of what we enjoy in the modern world came from accidental discoveries, be it fashion craze causing mauve, sweeteners, Teflon, or Gore-Tex. The chemists behind this stuff were smart enough to recognize that they accidentally discovered something special. In the process, these moments became so much more than happy accidents. They became discoveries that changed the world.
Hey Chemheads, thanks for watching. If you want more Sam Keen, check out a video he did for us on whether megasharks still exist. And if you want more history, check out 5 black chemists who changed the world. And regardless, click that there subscribe button for more chemistry goodness every week. And a big thanks to the Chemical Heritage Foundation for helping us out with this video.
Diffusion refers to the spread of culture traits from one group to another. It creates changes as cultural elements spread from one society to another through trade, migration, and mass communication. Culture diffused through the processes of enculturation, socialization, association, and integration. Enculturation takes place when one culture is spread to the other through learning, thus, education is the most popular enculturation. Socialization, on the other hand, refers to learning through constant exposure and experience to culture, which ultimately imbibe the latter to the system of values, beliefs, and practices of the individual or groups. Association is establishing a connection with the culture, thereby bridging area of convergence and cultural symbiosis. Lastly, integration is the total assimilation of culture as manifested by change of worldviews, attitudes, behavior, and perspectives of looking things.